Okay, I will call this meeting to order. It's 6:30 on Thursday, April 20th, and this is the regular Planning Commission meeting, and we are at Sammamish City Hall. So what we will start with this evening is roll call, and I will start on my left.
Roisin O'Farrell.
Nancy Anderson.
Larry Crandall.
Shanna Collins.
Eric Brooks.
Jane Garrison.
Matthew Petrich.
And I think that means that we're all here. So that's great. The next thing, actually, I have this written down. I wanted to introduce the new commissioner this evening. His name is Matthew Petrich. And I was just going to ask Commissioner Petrich to give a little introduction to say about how long you've lived in Sammamish, why you wanted to be on the commission, what's your professional experience, as long or as short as you like.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Matthew. I actually grew up in Sammamish. I moved here when I was one. I was born in Los Angeles. On and off over the past 40 some odd years, I've moved away 3 times with the intention of never coming back, and I've come back 3 times. This is my home. I'm really glad to be on the commission now. I think, contented myself over the past years being a neighbor and a member of the community who's been content to sort of grumble about what's going on around me and wish I could do something about it. And then, one day it occurred to me to actually do something about it. So here I am, partially inspired by events of the last several months to get involved and have a voice in the community. So here I am. My professional background, I graduated from college and sort of fumbled around for a while, finally went back to school. I have a law degree. Land use and environmental law was my primary focus. Did that until I found it wasn't making me happy. I got involved in food, which has got to be probably the happiest occupation in the world. Everybody loves food, right? So I did that for a number of years, and I ended up in California, and I didn't want to be in California, so I came home, and now I'm in real estate.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Well, welcome. We're lucky to have a new commissioner, and we're lucky that the position was filled so quickly. So thank you. So with that, if everyone's had a chance to look at the agenda, we'll need a motion to approve the agenda this evening.
I move that we approve the agenda as distributed.
Second.
Motion is seconded, and now we vote. All those in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
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 Anyone opposed, say nay. Okay, that's 7-0. So the agenda is approved, and now we will move to public comment. And this is the time during the evening that the public has a chance to speak on non-agenda related items. So tonight's agenda will include a discussion on neighborhood character and the Title 24 update, which is related to the comprehensive plan. If anyone would like to speak to something other than those 2 items, you'd have 3 minutes. I have one person so far on the list, and it's Jennifer Kim. And just state your name and your place of residence.
Jennifer Kim, 4001 239th Place Southeast. It's kind of agenda and non-agenda. It is relating to neighborhood character, but I also want to talk about Christy Malchow's motion that she presented last year to the Planning Commission about the buffers. When I think about neighborhood character, one of the things that strikes me about Sammamish in particular are the large coniferous trees. I mean, that's something that I love when I drive around and I see that. And I think a lot of us can agree that the newer developments, we're seeing a lot less of that. So the developer will come in, clear cut the entire lot, leave the required 25 or now 35% of the trees somewhere in the back of the lot, and then they're building the houses extremely close to the road, very close together. I mean, so close that you can even see, I can see on Highcroft from my car what people are watching on TV. So that to me is not the character of Sammamish. When I drive around and look at the older areas like Heritage Hills or even where I live, Summer Meadows, even in an area that's R4, they still left some of the larger trees. There is definitely a large buffer. I think Connor Jarvis is also one that you can look at where there was a large forest of trees, and if they had just left a thin row of trees there so that that entire area wasn't visible, the city would have had so many fewer complaints, because people were just upset that now that whole area was gone. And they did leave their 25% of trees, but it's way in the back. So my request to the Planning Commission is, when you're talking about neighborhood character, I hope that you'll give thoughtful consideration to Christine Malchow's proposal last year. I did hear it. I thought she gave a lot of really good input about buffers and, buffers, and even in areas that didn't have trees before, adding buffers in on arterials. And just really, please try to save the trees along the roads. I understand that we have to build, but in an R6 it might be hard, but in an R4, if there's some way that we can ask developers to just leave some of the trees and not clear cut everything, I think it would really make people here not as upset, and we'd be to accept the development a little bit more, and yeah, just help to retain the beauty of our city. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Okay.
Good evening. Ken Gamblin, 1830 216th Place Northeast. And I'd also like to speak a little bit to the idea of neighborhood character. I was here several weeks ago for a land acquisition meeting and public comment and some thought session. And one of the things that struck me was that through a survey that the city did, how many people had responded that they really are interested in preserving as much green and open space as possible. And during the course of that meeting, we also had a chance to all participate by going back to maps and on the back of the room that showed different options. And I again observed what an enormous amount of people were voting for greenery. And the pictures up there were all of trees. So my observation is a little bit like Jennifer's in that the character of Sammamish, even by our city logo, is the trees. And so many times as I'm going and looking at these newer developments, with the realization that the new tree ordinance was not in place when we built these, and so I don't want to judge what was going to happen currently, but how far apart and how far away they are from what I would actually envision as Sammamish. I moved here from California, and quite frankly, with most of the new developments, I can't tell the difference between the developments I saw in California and the developments I'm seeing up here now. So as you guys are looking at neighborhood character, I really like to have you think along in that direction. In as much as possible, how can we continue to have these large trees in large of numbers so that it continues this character of what everybody seems to agree embodies Sammamish, okay? So again, I know we have to develop. I'm not one of the people that say, stop development and don't develop anything. But I do think that through with some careful planning with yourself and the council and public input, maybe we can come up with a different look on these developments that we all have to live with. The developers go away, the people who build these go away, but we're here living with this, and I really believe hopefully we can come up with a better look on how we can develop as what's remaining left of Sammamish. So thanks for listening.
Thank you for your input. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak this evening? Okay. Okay, with that, we will move on to our first agenda item this evening, which is old business, and it will be neighborhood character. So I'll turn it over to staff, and I believe it'll be Mr. McIntyre who's giving a presentation.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Doug McIntyre, Senior Planner with DCD. I do want to, before I start, acknowledge welcome Commissioner Petrich. It's great to have you on the commission, and now we have a full 7-person commission, which is actually the first time, I think, since I have been here that we have had a 7-person commission. So I'm actually really excited for that. So just want to acknowledge that before we dive into it. And just as a side note, we understand that you have not been involved in some of the discussions that we've had to date on this particular topic. So feel free at any point to ask questions, and we will do our best to fill you in on what you're missing.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, neighborhood character. This is our I believe, fourth time discussing this topic. We began in late 2016 with a directive from City Council to dive into neighborhood character and what that means for Sammamish and what that means for how we regulate residential development. You will notice that your packet is a little bit thinner than, say, last meeting when it might have been 500 pages. So the reason for that is this is really an attempt to kind of finalize the Planning Commission's stance and the position on this topic now that we've talked about it for better part of four plus months. So I just want to acknowledge that before we really start the presentation, and also acknowledge the great conversations we've had in the past on this. So we have arrived at a good, I call it a block point in the process. And summarizing that a bit more specifically, our last two meetings, February 2nd and March 2nd. So it's been a little bit of time since we have grappled with this topic directly. I will do my best to fill you in on the gaps and as we go. We have generally started with a discussion on really conceptually arterial street buffers. If you recall back, even preceding the February 2nd meeting with the joint meeting with City Council, arterial street buffers were a major topic in that conversation, as well as low density residential transitions. In our March meeting, we refined it a little bit and actually proposed what that might look like through actual code amendments, and we discussed quite a bit of the ways in which we could proceed in essentially enhancing and protecting neighborhood character. And through that, those options, I call them, we had some really good feedback from the commissioners on what was more palatable and what was less palatable. And that essentially has gotten us to today, where we are really refining that down to a stance, one collective stance with the Planning Commission. And I have the note here that we will be summarizing this in a memo, and that memo will go to City Council. And our plan is to have the chair and vice chair meet directly with the mayor and deputy mayor on this topic to do the handoff, essentially summarize what we've talked about, why we are where we are, and how we think this topic can move forward. So that is tentatively planned for early May, although we don't have a date specifically scheduled. We'll work with schedules and calendars to get that on the books. So just a reiteration, we have mentioned this every time that we have spoken about neighborhood character, that this task is not a formal action by Planning Commission. We are not asking you to recommend any sort of policy or code amendments to City Council. We are simply being tasked with researching the topic, basically, and formulating a collective stance and then reporting back to the City Council on what we talked about. So that's cannot emphasize that enough, that is our role tonight. Again, just to be a little bit more specific, we will be considering the various options that we've talked about and then move forward on that. So before I get into the summary of everything, I wanted to hit on the high-level neighborhood character topic, because we got pretty detailed in our last conversation, but I think it's a good point in the process to bring it back up a little bit and kind of reset the stage for what we're really talking about. And throughout that process, we have always acknowledged that it is a topic that can be very broad and can also mean an infinite number of things to a wide variety of people. So we have been very honest and open in that it is a difficult topic to address, and it's even harder to implement through code. So with this slide, I wanted to just say what neighborhood character means for me. So this is a snapshot of where I actually live, and it's just down the street from the Macefield house that you see in the top left. And neighborhood character for where I live is very different. It's where I live on a grid network. It's pretty densely packed. There's a lot of commercial amenities nearby, and it's an older established neighborhood. So that's how I view it in many ways. Not always, but But it depends on the person and what your perspective is. So we also looked at what does that mean for Sammamish, and I think that the key there is that, well, it depends on where you live and where you spend most of your time. Snapshot of Sahali gives you a sense of the suburban development butting up against forested areas, recreation space nearby, and an arterial going through the middle of it. So that all those things impact how we view neighborhood character. Another example is some of the, what I would call maybe lots ready for infill development, where they might be surrounded by suburban and other subdivisions, but they themselves have not developed. And I think that also changes how you view neighborhood character. In this slide, you see a pretty large undeveloped area in the middle of it, surrounded by some maybe older county development, as well as newer development permitted under the city. And a snapshot of that street that's at 8th, Southeast 8th between 218th and 214th. You see the very large mature trees on the south end of that street, and that also impacts neighborhood character. And if you take a look at the picture on the right, again, you'll notice that there's no sidewalks, so maybe it's less walkable. Maybe there's just a different feel based on that. But all of those things feed into how we view neighborhood character. And then we also have commercial areas in the city and a little bit higher activity nodes. Inglewood and 228th is shown here, and that's a very different character than some of the previous slides. Very little residential in that immediate area. Maybe it's not so walkable, but there might be more pedestrian activity here just based on the uses. So again, all of those elements impact how we view neighborhood character. And then the final point I wanted to make is sometimes it changes. You'll notice that this is the 228th and 4th intersection where the new Met Market building is, and this is an older aerial off of Google Maps. But the point here is that prior to that, that was actually pretty low density. Some might even say rural in character, maybe. But it clearly is very different now. So our sense of neighborhood character depends on where we're at and changes over time. So getting into summarizing what we've already talked about, you'll recall that we started out with the street buffers. We kind of grappled with this topic in terms of really what we were trying to achieve, but also how to implement it. There was a lot of discussion on supporting a scaled approach, essentially looking at it from providing a buffer based on the lot dimensions, but doing it based on a percentage of those dimensions. And then at our last meeting, we had some good conversations about the desire to cap that at a maximum size because there were concerns about takings, there were concerns about equity between neighbors if they have widely varying lot dimensions. If you have again, I call these the shotgun lots. If you have a shotgun lot next to a square lot, those buffers may be very different, but they're on the same arterial. So there was a lot of conversation about that. And ultimately, I think, again, what we talked about was really making sure that it was scaled, but making sure that there's equity there, so capping it at a certain point. So we didn't talk about what that cap was, but we did that to talk about as a way to get at the concept. So that's what we're trying to summarize here. We also had pretty good discussions on the low-density residential zone transitions. We showed several slides in our last presentation about just different areas of the city where, say, R1 property abuts either R4 or R6 zone property, or even higher in some cases. And we tried to step through some different scenarios of what that buffer might look like. And we approached it from similarly to the arterial street buffers, where we wanted to make sure that it was equitable and it was capped and scaled. So we took essentially the same approach there with those buffers. But ultimately, what the Planning Commission decided was that there wasn't really a whole lot of support for these types of buffers. And one comment that was made in the last meeting was that if eventually this does get looked at further, that it should really be addressed only when an R1 abuts an R6 or greater zone parcel. So just wanted to make that comment. And then finally, one of the major topics we discussed was, well, what happens in the buffer? So we require these buffers, but what can we do to get a higher quality pedestrian environment out of that? And we talked about the more undisturbed kind of natural character of some of those buffers versus maybe a more active buffer. And there was a lot of discussion about in situations where it made sense and where there was maybe existing pedestrian facilities to connect a trail, that, yeah, we should look at that. But in other areas where it was less developed and more undisturbed, to keep it that way. So that was a major topic discussed as well. So in closing, I just want to really put everything on one slide, that the major points, again, the major points that will be put into the memo that will get discussed with the mayor and deputy mayor. We, again, supported the scaled approach to buffers on the principal arterials and capping that maximum size. Not a whole lot of support for the low density buffers. And the point here that I neglected to mention earlier was that as another alternative, the Planning Commission talked about, well, can we look at landscaping standards and maybe improve that as a means to get what we want, instead of using the hard approach with a large buffer. And then again, the final comment there is that the Planning Commission supported the idea of using a flexible approach to the buffers, that where it made sense to do certain activities, to implement it that way, but when it was not feasible, to keep it maybe undisturbed. So summarizing at the bottom, again, this will go into the memo to discuss with council, and we'll kick it up the chain, I guess. So with that, I will stop talking and open it up to questions, and I'll do my best to answer.
Does anybody have any questions, comments, feedback?
I have a question. I think neighborhood character can be visual or social, and I think visual is the smaller part of that, and I think buffers are a very small part of the visual. So what I wonder about is why you chose to call this buffers instead, or why you chose to call it neighborhood character instead of buffers.
That's a great question. And when the topic was generated back at the end of, toward the end of last year, I think it might have been a little bit earlier, I think it was an acknowledgement of the broader scale, and the way that we looked at implementing it was through buffers. And so it started, again, at that kind of really high level of what do we want to enhance and protect, and then it immediately went to, well, how do we do that? And so that's where we began, and then it continued on that path up until today.
I think also...
What I would worry about is that when all is said and done, we'll think we've completed neighborhood character when we've really only completed looking at buffers. That would be my concern.
I hear where you're coming from, Commissioner Garrison, actually. I think I just wanted to add to what Mr. McIntyre was saying, is that when we met with City Council and we had our joint meeting, there was a lot of talk about neighborhood character and how we should attack the problem. And I think City Council decided that they wanted to come up with a few things that we could actually do to address neighborhood character. And so the buffers was one of the first things that came up as something that we could really do, something that we could really attack. So I think that's why we're talking about buffers. If anybody else kind of remembers that conversation, I think that's where it came from. But I agree. I don't think we're done with neighborhood character. There are lots of other things to discuss.
Go ahead.
That leads to one of my questions, is this just the first step in the promotion of neighborhood character? Because like Jane said, I just want to make sure that this is not the end-all, be-all of the neighborhood character discussion. I'm assuming it's not, but.
Correct. This is really where we started. I think the conversations with City Council will provide a little bit more clarity on where we will be headed. But I think we've tried really hard throughout this entire process to continue to acknowledge that this topic is very complex, and it can mean, again, an infinite number of things to a wide variety of people. And we've mentioned in the past that other ways you could accomplish this is through potentially minimum lot size, potentially design standards, other types of architectural standards. They range in complexity from relatively achievable to very complicated and harder to implement. So again, there's an infinite number of ways to go about that.
I guess what mine is an opinion rather than a question. I really think we're on the right track by focusing. I don't like to use narrow, maybe that's redundant when you say focus, but we're going to take some different steps, and if we can take some proper steps, which this is leading up to, I think this is great. And one of the things that I heard you say was quality. I don't think you used the word quantity, but it's important that we look at the quality of the buffer. And I think we're doing that in the treatment of the setbacks and the fairness. The quality, to me, of course, I think trees most of the time, but a 100-year oak tree has a lot more quality than 17 willow trees sitting over there someplace. So I did get away from the concept of buffer, but the buffer can be many things. And I think quality of the buffer is very important. So it's good for us to move forward and adopt some of these.
I think also City Council was a little bit wary of going through a visioning process where we vision neighborhood character. I think that they wanted to stay away from that because they didn't think that it would really result in anything tangible. So it's something that we could consider if the Planning Commission wants to give that feedback to City Council. But during the joint meeting, most of what I heard was we should kind of stay away from doing a visioning process, and we should move forward with some sort of tangible way to address the neighborhood character issue.
The comment that was really a comment that I have, like a current, when I look particularly at 228, so I drive up and down that road, I don't know how many times a day. And when I see some of the, and I hate to always pick on Highcroft, it seems to be, but it's the newest development on 228 and probably the first neighborhood where the backyards back out onto our main road. Anything else that's there seems to be buffered by fences and landscaping of some kind. And as was mentioned earlier, I too have seen what the residents are watching in their living room as I'm driving by too. And I just wonder, when we talk about neighborhood character, when we talk about the setbacks and buffers, and then when I go to pick on this neighborhood yet again, that is there anything apart from waiting another 5 to 10 years for those trees to grow in, if there's anything that as a city that we can go back and kind of screen the rest of us from such a development, and also give the people who have paid a substantial amount of money for those properties some privacy. Because I do think, you know, none of us want to see what somebody else is watching on TV as we're driving home, nor do the people in those homes want us to know what they're watching on television either. So I think about that particular neighborhood because it stands right out there, and it's really the only one that's kind of standing out there with no kind of protection from the elements, as it were. That's kind of the biggest thing that I think about when I think about the setbacks and the buffers.
Kind of building on that, so we were talking about, so you have these 3 bullet points. On the memo, you have 6, and I don't know if that's intended or not, but there's this kind of bullet point about incorporating sufficient focus on tree protection, and we were talking about landscape regulations. And speaking of the Highcroft, you know, they do have those trees along there. they seem like they're planted in a way that doesn't necessarily promote their kind of full maturity, in that they're kind of in amongst these landscape walls. And that might be an instance where we have to go to those landscape regulations to kind of make sure that the mature tree can actually happen. Because I think that at the end of the day, that's what we want along there for this buffer. But if they'll never reach that maturity, then they won't serve that function, which may not have been the function that was trying to be served in that particular case. But I also caution or want to make sure that this particular first step, both that it'll support and it will be supported by future steps. And I know that's a little hard to do, but so try not to paint ourselves into a corner with this, or recognize that we might need to tweak this when other steps start getting introduced into the mix. I thought it was interesting reading about the neighboring cities, and that they, on the arterials, that they support the possibility for arterial growth. So the paving surface getting wider. So that starts kind of feeding into this buffer that we're otherwise setting up for landscaping, but it might get eaten up by arterial growth. So there's that kind of moving part in there that we probably need to consider. And then the last question I would have is, what's the possibility of a design review kind of board being assigned to kind of address this neighborhood character thing, where I think we all agree that it does mean different things to different people. But if you had a group of people that were representatives of that area, kind of helping make that decision, it might actually make the process easier from a code implementation standpoint, but maybe not. Just a suggestion.
So to respond to the Commissioner Brooks's question on design review, that I mentioned earlier, the ways you could approach it. There's that scale of complexity where some are pretty easy, and I would say that one's kind of on the end of being much more complicated and time intensive and administrative intensive. So I can't speak to future plans for that. I don't believe there are any, and I'm not aware of any at the moment. But I think that's more of the maybe heavy-handed approach to doing that, to enhancing neighborhood character or preserving a certain type of neighborhood character. So, but again, I don't know of any specifics related to that. So, and I did just real quickly want to mention, you had mentioned the other cities, and that is in the memo, and I did forget to address that in the presentation, but we, at the end of the March 2nd meeting, there was a desire for Planning Commission to have a better sense of what other cities did, and we've looked into basically Washington cities, and they provide the best context for us because we are a growth management state, and we're one of 13 growth management states in the country. So when you look at out of the state, it's harder to compare. So I did a little analysis of some of the local jurisdictions, and I found a couple instances where there were arterial street setbacks, and those are in the memo. And I again didn't address it in the presentation, but they were done in a very different way. They were not, in my opinion, done as a means to enhance neighborhood character. And Commissioner Brooks had pointed out that I believe it's the city of Sammamish requires a certain setback from an arterial street to accommodate future expansion of that street. And I think that that's a very different approach. And we take care of that through development review when we look at plat applications. But that is, in my opinion, not a tool to address neighborhood character necessarily. It may be, but probably not frequently.
I was wondering if we might go through their points one by one in order so that we could keep on track. I don't want to be left with a whole bunch of amendments at the end of this.
Well, I was going to say we can go through all the points, or we can go through these points first because I think they're probably the highest priority. But in my opinion, this serves as a good starting point for City Council to start with. I think we've had a lot of discussion about these options, and it's really now sort of up to them to take it to the next level. And I think we're all supportive of buffers on the arterials, you know, saving trees where that is possible, creating recreation spaces where that's possible. The landscape standards, I think this is kind of a nice package. And so we can go through all of those, but really what I'm more interested in is if the commission feels that this is enough. Is there anything that we've missed? Is there anything that you would like to add when the memo goes to City Council? So let's do that first, and then if we still want to go through each bullet point, we can.
I guess I agree with the chair, especially the third one supports the idea that a buffer be flexible. I mean, that says a lot to me. And giving that to City Council, it seems like something they would be very receptive of. So I like these 3 points. Yes.
Okay. And we won't be doing any amendments tonight. This is very informal, so there's no motions, there's no amendments. It's just, you know, sort of our opinions, and I just want to make sure that our opinions get sufficiently communicated to City Council. So.
May I ask a question? And I apologize, I'm coming into this discussion late, but is this discussion around buffers looking forward at future development, or are we talking about establishing buffers potentially, you know, on arterials where development exists, and you know, if it's these developments on 228th where we're watching everybody's television, is that part of the discussion, or is that's a missed opportunity, and we're talking about the neighboring property or whatever's down the street?
Yeah, we're talking about the future, because all of those developments have been developed based on whatever their development agreement was and whatever their final development plan was. So this would be for all future developments.
I think that it's important. I like the need for the strong purpose statement. I think that's, you know, if we have to include or not include, I think that that's as important as these three, frankly. So if we're debating on which ones of these to show, I think really all 6 of them on the memo are important.
I liked all 6 too, especially, you know, incorporating a sufficient focus on tree protection. I thought that was really important to add that in there too.
Right, because we're talking, we heard some public comment about kind of preservation of trees, so this kind of focus on keeping the existing trees as part of that, or augmenting existing conditions as this buffer versus completely scraping everything out. Sure, you have this buffer and then you plant some new stuff in there, but that's not really the intent, I don't believe.
Yep.
Sorry, I have one comment on the tree protection issue as well. I think I like the sort of scaled or flexible approach to the way we're talking about this. I live in a part of Sammamish where the lots are very small and the homes are very large, and there are these very old conifer trees that have become stranded. And for example, I have 2 in my yard that are now leaning because we get these storms that have come in, and there are no, all the trees between my house and Japan have been cut down, so they are now bearing the brunt of these storms. So I think in some cases we're asking for trouble by leaving one tall old conifer standing. So I would like to approach this from the perspective of what's in the long-term interest, and that may be cutting down that big tree, but requiring that something else is planted that will actually survive and grow to maturity, similar to what we were talking about in 228th with Highcroft. So make sure it's rational.
And that's where I think the landscape standards come in.
If I could add to that, the Commission and Council went through an update to the tree retention standards as well last year, and that code does have essentially a priority that you step through when you are retaining trees, and it hits almost directly on the comment Commissioner Petrich just made about preserving contiguous stands of trees, because that is more likely to survive. When you preserve maybe a part of that, you expose trees that had not been exposed to wind and weather, and they're less likely to survive. So just wanted to make that point that we do also cover that in tree retention standards.
Well, I think if the commission is supportive, I'm supportive of having, let's go ahead with all 6 bullet points
Yeah.
and put them in the memo and see what happens.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, with that, we finish this item for tonight. So what we'll do next is new business, and this is the Title 24 update, which has to do with the process in which we use to update the comprehensive plan. And
So are we going to go through this point by point or not?
I thought we decided no, but if you have anything else that you'd like to add, is there anything on each of those points that you want to
Yes.
talk about?
Yes,
Oh,
each
okay.
point.
Okay.
So I guess I'm off on the wrong foot again. I'm just, it seemed like a logical way to move the way staff presented it to us, and I have comments on each one.
Okay.
Number one, I thought we dismissed the idea of basing the buffer width on a percentage of the lot dimension. I distinctly remember Commissioner Frank saying, lose the math. And we all agreed. And if you base it and scale it on a lot dimension, there's no defense against a taking. To me, it's a taking. If you base it on the purpose of the buffer, then it's not a taking. It has rationale behind it. This number 1 and number 2, I'm arguing with.
I think the way that staff tried to address that was putting the maximum on the maximum on the buffer. That's how I understand it.
Correct. Thank you, Commissioner Garrison. I want to address the discussions that you referenced. In putting this memo together, I went back and listened to all the meetings, and sometimes I had to listen to them a couple times. So the way that part of that conversation went was that I do recall Commissioner Blau mentioning that take the math out of it, and then we talked about the way that would get implemented in the case where there's just one size, is that we use the term the one size fits all approach. And the concern with that is that because of the fact that we have a wide variety of lot dimensions and wide variety of lot layouts, and some are not rectangular or square, some are trapezoids, polygons, we have an infinite configuration of lots, that the concern with having just the one buffer would actually be more likely to result in a taking. And the conversation went on to then get where Commissioner Collins just referenced that we wanted to cap it at that point. So that's how that logic went.
So you're going to still keep the math, you're going to do a percentage of the lot but cap it.
I think
So it's not based on the purpose of the buffer or the location of the buffer, what you're buffering. It's not based on that at all. And that seems so rational and so easy to do. I can't understand why you would go to a whole nother length to put math into it.
I don't see how it's possible to do it without math, because there has to be, we can't just go down 228th Avenue with, just 5 feet or 10 feet or 12 feet. If we only do 5 feet, we won't have enough room for a substantial buffer. So I don't know how in some places we could take 20 feet, some places we could take, I don't see how we could just do one buffer all the way down to 28th Street.
I don't see how you could do varying buffers and be fair.
to address that point, when we do look at, in this case, the idea being, again, we're talking in concept, we are not talking about any specific lot, but by using one of the lot dimensions, either the length, the width, or the depth, it would be then proportional to that lot, whereas one single quantity would not potentially not be fair to a lot that's maybe a little bit shallower. And so that was the concern there, was running into issues related to takings, regulatory takings. So that was an attempt to get site by site to make it appropriate for each type of parcel. So you're correct that there might be some level of, I think Frank used the term sawtooth in there. Over time, maybe you look 100 years down the road if these are implemented, and you look back in time and you might be able to see some of the buffers varying, but those would always be appropriate to one of the dimensions of each of those lots. So that was the attempt there.
So I just wonder, as we're talking through, I'm wondering if, do we need to establish a minimum buffer width that's going to serve the purpose that we're trying to, you know what I mean? So if it does sawtooth, right, I guess that's okay. Maybe you just have more buffer in some places, but I feel that there's a minimum buffer width and that would need to be in existence to be able to achieve what we're trying to achieve. Because if we did
That's
a
a really good
percentage,
point.
it might be only 5 feet, and then, like you say, it doesn't
That
do any
doesn't
good.
do any good.
And so there's got to be a minimum, I think, maybe.
Thank you, Commissioner Brooks. That's actually a really good point that we have not discussed up until this point. So that, I think, is actually something that we could definitely add in, that concept have both a minimum and a maximum on there for essentially the maximum being the assurance of the property owner, and then the minimum being the assurance of the public.
Right.
That we have this kind of bookends on each side. And I think that's actually a really, really good idea.
I think the important thing for tonight, too, is to remember that we're trying to keep it broad, because I think City Council's task will be to, get really in the weeds and decide the actual maximums and minimums, and it's really our task tonight to deliver this sort of broad concept of what we see. But I think the minimums is a great idea. That's the same idea as the signs, right? It's like everyone is entitled to this much, and this much would be great, but at least we get this much. So, is that sufficient, Commissioner Garrison?
I am in total disagreement with scaling.
Okay.
I
have
think
to-
it ought to be based on the purpose of the buffer and where it's located. What is it intended to do? And scaling is just it doesn't relate to anything except the math.
Is there anyone else who feels strongly against the scaling? Okay, so let it be known that Commissioner Garrison is, very concerned about the scaling. I think that's important to note, but I think we probably need to move on.
Number 3.
Oh, I think we're gonna hear from Mr. Thomas, our Director of Community Development.
Just briefly to Commissioner Garrison's first point that she's brought up. For the purposes of this evening, and I think all of you have latched on to the idea of what we're trying to accomplish this evening, we're trying to report back the discussion of the Planning Commission on the assignment from City Council to the City Council for further direction, if that's the pleasure of the council at that point, once they receive this information. So I think it's a great idea that's come up for the memo. If the commission was so inclined, I don't see any harm in not only presenting the prevailing view of the commission on this point, but also presenting in the memo the alternative view that was raised as well. So for this point and for any others, as we work through the list here this evening, we'll certainly incorporate that and then have the chair review before she signs the memo and forwards it on to the mayor, and with the meeting that we'll have in early May. So I just wanted to bring that up. I don't think there's only one point of view we can express in the memo for each area of subject matter. We can certainly present those alternatives as well.
Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's move. The second one is about the maximum buffer width.
I've covered that.
Okay.
If we lose the math, we don't have to worry about a taking. Number 3, I think a purpose statement, I tried to write one, and I came up with a whole paragraph, which I'm sure everybody will be thrilled with. Buffers in neighborhoods have many purposes, including the creation of obvious visual breaks between sprawling developments, the promotion of neighborhood identity, the establishment of places for linkages to public walkways and other neighborhoods, the preservation of areas for environmental conservation, groundwater recharge, drainage, including continuous riparian landscapes, and sufficient tree massing for effective canopy development, and the reduction of impacts from traffic and incompatible land uses.
I think that's great. And it makes me think, Commissioner Brooks made a really good point that this is really important. If we had a purpose statement, that would be really helpful. What if we ask Mr. McIntyre to include Commissioner Garrison's purpose statement? Maybe if you want to shorten it, you could work with Commissioner Garrison. And if everyone's supportive of that, we could have that as our purpose statement.
Sure, yeah.
Sound good? Okay, very good. And so that works?
That was amazing.
There you go. And that's so
The next one, I support that idea that buffers should be flexible depending on their use and the site characteristics. The next one, consideration for the quality of the buffer. I think that's important, and I have worked with codes where the developer can choose a setback depending on what they want to put in. For example, if you have a 30-foot setback, you could have a more rural type of, or looser, I should say, type of landscaping. Maybe with a 20-foot setback, you would have a fence and landscaping, or a 10-foot setback, maybe you'd have a concrete wall with extreme planting. Or if we are promoting a dense area with visual access, such as we might do in town center with a parking lot or something like that, we might have a 10-foot setback with trellises, arbors, vines, and benches. It depends on where it is, and I think you could have a choice. I remember when I was working in Issaquah, I got in a police car and drove around, and they were very interested, the Issaquah police, in having visibility to cover large areas from their cars. They did not have the capacity to do night surveillance on foot. So I think it's very important that we ask the police about this. And it just killed me, I remember, because I wanted to hide these big parking lots from the street. But they want to see in. So we have this major conflict that I think we need to keep in mind. And I don't know what the Sammamish police would say, or if they've made advancements since then. It's been a few years ago.
It's a good point. Do you have anything to say about the last? Is it they incorporate a sufficient focus on tree protection?
Yes. And this brings up, a couple of people have talked about this tonight, and I think it's just crucial to neighborhood character. We talk about tree protection, but then our codes permit a 30-foot lot width. With a 2-car garage, there aren't any trees left after site development. You can't save a tree in the 10 feet between driveways because they're too vulnerable. Big old trees are too vulnerable when they're paved all around, and you're left with just a few of them. And trees make pavement palatable, so that has a whole lot to do with our neighborhood character. Even at 4 dwelling units per acre, I think our code has a 30-foot minimum lot frontage. And we have acres and acres zoned at 4 dwelling units per acre in Sammamish. What I'm hoping for is that our canopy study that we're now doing, that we found out about with the Parks Department, will help determine minimum lot width and maybe even density in some areas. I'm hoping that will influence our land use and our zoning. And I don't know how other people feel about having a minimum lot width that is over so much of our town that you cannot save the trees next to the roads.
Okay. Is that it? Does anybody have anything else to add? All right. So we will move on to the next item. And as
How would that be presented to council? Would you just make that comment to council
I can,
the lot width?
about lot width and how our zoning code conflicts with tree preservation?
I don't think that's part of our discussion, and it's not something that we've discussed up until this point, so I don't feel comfortable taking that to city council at this point, but maybe Mr. Thomas has something to add.
I sure do. Good evening again. You know, I think Commissioner Garrison's comments, not just from the last couple of minutes, but her comments running through tonight's meeting and also comments from other commissioners here, what's starting, I think, to trend in my mind is there's a correlation here between your discussion on neighborhood character and a discussion on our subdivision regulations and standards that are in code. In the last couple of minutes, I've heard minimum lot width mentioned in subdivision development. 10 minutes ago, lot depth was mentioned in your dialogue. And so, you know, the regulatory components to this, they all intertwine to some degree, right? And we are going to be talking to City Council on May 9th about the development code in general and updates that we've done to the code and updates that we haven't done to the code since we incorporated in 1999 and the code that we did inherit from King County as part of incorporation. So to that end, to answer your question, how will your comments on that be incorporated? I think we'll incorporate them into the memo as again, your additional view that was expressed on that particular bullet, but I think your comments will also translate over to our discussion with the council on May 9th in relation to the development code in general. So again, really good comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And then the last one. I think it's the last one. Oh, no, that was the last one.
Okay, so as Director Thomas said, we'll include Commissioner Garrison's thoughts about maximum lot width. And was it lot depth or lot width, or both? Jane? Was it maximum lot width or depth, or both?
I didn't want it scaled. I wanted it,
No, I'm talking about your new comment related to lot size.
lot width.
Lot width. Okay.
Minimum lot width.
Minimum lot
30
width.
feet will not allow us to protect trees, existing trees along roads.
So let's have that as maybe just an additional item, similar to what we did with murals in the other memo. we put murals and the electronic reader boards as a separate comment, so let's do it that way.
Thank you. Definitely, I can make those amendments. Thank you for the comments.
Great. Okay. So I think we will turn it over to Mr. Goodman, who is going to give us some information about the Title 24 update, which has to do with the process for which we use to update the city's comprehensive plan.
Yes, good evening, commissioners. David Goodman, management analyst with community development. And this is a new topic, which is exciting. So because there's some new folks on the commission and because a good basic understanding of the Growth Management Act and how that influences our comprehensive planning process is going to be pretty important for doing good work on this topic. Tonight, I'm mostly going to focus on a general introduction to the Growth Management Act and the comprehensive planning process and what that means and how it's usually administered. And then next time we meet in about a month on May 18th, I will present to you a draft version of our proposed code, which will actually replace the current code, and we'll deliberate the specifics then. And unlike the sign code, where the packet looked like a doorstop, the new code for this should only be about 8 or 10 pages, so a lot more user-friendly.
Could I ask a question? Is there any reason why we can't see the revisions tonight?
So I'll talk a little bit about what's going to be in them, some of the highlights. We felt like it would be more productive to focus on the background for this meeting and then go into them in more detail next time in May.
Will that be another study session?
That will be, I think that's the last time we're going to be discussing this with the commission, but as I said, it's much briefer than the other things that we've been working on with you so far this year. But it'll be included in the next packet, and I'm happy. It's not fully complete yet, but I'll be happy to answer any questions you have about the specifics after I go through that a little later in the presentation.
And so is it possible to add another study session since we really haven't had time to vet this before a formal deliberation?
I'm going to leave that up to the director to determine. I don't think, so I'll also get into this a little later. The actual, I'll leave it to the boss first.
The answer is yes. We've scheduled a public hearing for, I believe it's May 18th. If the commission on May 18th feels like you'd like to continue the dialogue on the subject, we did intentionally schedule one-item meetings in June for any overflow that comes through March, April, and May. So yes, there will be an opportunity for the commission to continue your discussion.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So King County, and I apologize if this is review for some of you, but it's important background for what we're going to discuss. King County, and by extension the city of Sammamish, plans under the Growth Management Act. And the Growth Management Act requires that all cities and counties planning underneath it adopt a comprehensive plan to serve as a centerpiece of planning efforts within the jurisdiction. And the law requires certain elements or chapters to each comprehensive plan, and these include land use, housing, capital facilities, utilities, transportation, newly economic development, and parks and recreation. And these elements are used as sort of guideposts for all the decisions that are made in the city on those topics throughout the time that the comprehensive plan is adopted and it is the current plan. And that includes such things as development regulations, so all zoning needs to be in compliance with the future land use map in the comprehensive plan, and all sorts of other decisions about programming and budget and things like that. So the comprehensive plan really serves as the kind of primary policy document for the city. So the Growth Management Act currently requires that cities update their comprehensive plans every 8 years, and this is actually a recent change. It used to be 7 years, and it was changed a couple of years ago in response to the economic recession. And this 7 versus 8 years is a distinction that I'll touch on in a second. In between those major updates, the GMA, the Growth Management Act, permits cities and counties to consider certain types of amendments once a year. And there are a few exceptions to that rule in which you're allowed to amend the comprehensive plan outside of that limit. And if you're interested in that, I can talk a little bit more about that later. But the housing element that you deliberated upon, was that earlier this year or later last year, was an example of one of the exceptions to that. And although as I said, the Growth Management Act allows cities and counties to amend their comprehensive plans up to once per year, it's actually left to the local jurisdictions to determine the frequency, process, and criteria for amending the comprehensive plan.
Mr. Goodman, can you just for the benefit of all the new commissioners, when was the actual date of the last rewrite? Is that 2016? Or
2015.
That was 2015.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So typically the amendments that are proposed during this up to once annual process come in 2 categories. The first is called a site-specific future land use map amendment. And what that is a proposal to usually upzone or change zoning from commercial to residential or vice versa, change the designation of a property or group of properties on the future land use map, and that's a picture of it right there. And there's also text amendments wherein somebody can propose a change in policy or some other written aspect of the comprehensive plan. Although there's a limit to the level of change that can occur, so it can't really be an extremely substantial change, and it can't change the urban growth area in the city as well. And an important point also is that unlike a lot of other land use actions where there's a codified set of criteria or either at the local or state level, comprehensive plan amendments are legislative actions that are subject to approval by the city council, which basically means the council can approve, deny, or modify any proposal it has the power to do so, and it's not really limited in its powers to do that. So there's not really an objective set of criteria that if a proposal meets it, it has to be approved or it has to be denied. It's ultimately up to the city council. So Sammamish's current code relating to updating the comprehensive plan is called Title 24, and it hasn't been updated in 14 years, since 2003. So what Title 24 includes is laying out what types of amendments are permitted during the annual review. It also still refers to a 7-year review cycle, which, as I mentioned, has changed recently to an 8-year review cycle. It includes a process for city-initiated amendments as well as citizen-initiated amendments. It has some criteria for how the Planning Commission and City Council are meant to review proposals. And it also lays out a pretty detailed public participation program for the city. So those review criteria, I'll just go through real quickly. Applicants are asked these questions and need to provide answers to these questions when they submit their application. So what is being proposed and why, what the anticipated impacts are, and what kind of geographic area would be affected by the proposal, why the existing comprehensive plan guidance or map is no longer relevant and should no longer apply, whether the proposal is compliant with the goals of the Growth Management Act, whether the proposal complies with the city vision statement, and how the city's functional plans support the change. So that's things like transportation plans and service delivery. And then, so those A through F are asked of every applicant, and then additionally for applicants for land use map amendments, whether the proposal implements the goals of the comp plan and is not incompatible with nearby existing and permitted land use. So as I mentioned, that is what's required of the applicant, and this is some guidance for the commission and the council when reviewing, but as I mentioned, these are legislative actions, so it could be that an applicant has wonderful answers to all these, but it remains in the power of the council and the commission to deny an application. So Title 24 also lays out the process for the annual review. It talks about the planning commission and the council setting a docket. It talks about certain proposals that are approved to be on the docket receiving a more thorough analysis from staff. It talks about the council and the commission's powers with regard to approving or denying or modifying proposals. But ultimately, it's our position that in most cases, Title 24 is overly prescriptive in some areas and too vague in other areas. And what I mean by that is in some cases, the rules and processes are set out in such detail that it kind of prevents staff from having a lot of flexibility both in terms of analyzing it and the length of time that they're allowed to analyze it, but also in terms of the ability for staff to map out how their calendar and see how these proposals are going to fit in the yearly work plan. Because we could have a case where nobody submits a proposal and things go on as normal, or we could have a case where there's many proposals that are going to take a lot of work that we might not otherwise have time for. So in addition to all of those, Title 24 contains a lot of provisions that are no longer relevant, such as basin plans or provisions focused on development regulations, which were more relevant in the early days of the city when this title was first adopted. And also things like joint planning agreements and interlocal agreements for regional transportation facilities, which aren't really relevant anymore and have been kind of, there are other plans and other documents that the city has adopted that cover these things at this point. So it's for all those reasons that rather than do what we're doing with the sign code, which is amend and edit the current code and leave it as is, in this case, we're actually just going to get rid of the entire code and replace it with a new one, which we're going to call Title 24A. So some of our goals for Title 24A are to streamline the amendment process, both in practice and as written, by which I mean make it clearer for people reading about it and who want to understand how the process is going to go, but also provide better direction for staff who are going to coordinate and administer the process. We want to provide a flexible but predictable schedule for the periodic and biennial update, by which I mean we want to be able to accept amendments when we're able to, but also maintain some flexibility so that, for example, the code will allow us to not go through an amendment process when we're on the cusp of doing a full periodic review. We also want the new title to allow for more advanced planning for consideration of proposals, which is what I had just referenced, where we want a little more flexibility to place these pieces of analysis in our work plans over the course of a year or 2 years. And we also want to eliminate excess wording and remove irrelevant sections so that it's really cut down to size and only focuses on what we need it to focus on. So I can give you a couple teasers on what's going to be contained in Title 24A that is going to be substantially different from what's in Title 24. And the first thing I'll say is we looked a lot at other cities in the Puget Sound region to see how they handle this in their code. And the two model cities that we felt had the best code were Mill Creek and Shoreline. So, and these are very short. These are only 3 or 4 page long pieces of code. So if you're interested in reading those and comparing them to what we have, it might be a useful illustration. But some of the other things that we're looking to change, rather than have an annual docket process, we're proposing to move to a 2-year biennial review that's synced up with the budget process. The idea there being that A, we are able to better plan out our analysis and calendar for potentially reviewing these proposals, and in doing and in syncing it up with the budget, making sure that we have the resources to do that. In a lot of cases, if you've got these complicated, multi-parcel land use changes that you're analyzing, that's a really big piece of analysis that needs to be done, and it's going to be hard to do something like that squeezed in with everything else that you're already planned on doing. So doing it over 2 years gives us that extra flexibility and also allows us to make sure that it's synced up with the budget in a way that gives us the tools to complete a good analysis. We're also going to place more emphasis on referencing the RCW. That's the actual text of the Growth Management Act. A lot of the current code is made up of lists of things that are already contained in the RCW. And a good example of why that's problematic is that, as I mentioned, the code still reads that the periodic updates, or the big update for the comprehensive plan, happens once every 7 years. Since then, the RCW has changed to once every 8 years, and that would require a code amendment anyway to fix that. So in this case, we're going to stop referencing specific terms from the RCW and simply reference the RCW so that any changes that happen therein don't affect our code and don't make our code out of date. And we're also going to include some new, clearer criteria for review and improved flexibility so that we allow the commission and the council to be more clear on what criteria they're using, but also allow them that flexibility that they're entitled to make decisions based on whatever they think is most important. So, as was mentioned, tonight went over a little bit of the background. Currently, we're scheduled to have a public hearing on May 18th. But as Director Thomas mentioned, if you feel that there is a need for more deliberation on this, we'll be happy to accommodate that. And on that note, I also just want to mention that this is mostly a procedural code, so there's not a whole lot of policy choices that need to be made. That being said, I will do my best both tonight and next month to present this in a way that makes clear where the points are that the commission can have input and can move the needle, so to speak, a little bit, and also be clear on what the required sections are where we're either required by the RCW or those other areas where we don't really have much of a choice in what goes on in the code. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and Doug here, who has a lot of years of working on comp plans in various jurisdictions, can also help as well.
Thank you very much. Not only reading the memorandum, but listening to your presentation made it very clear. And two things that's really, one, I think I knew before, and you mentioned that we're not rewriting the comp plan. I sat through a couple years ago watching the Planning Commission and the City Council work on the comp plan. So I think we want to narrow this 24A. It seemed like what I'm envisioning is a very simple prescriptive document to work with the comp plan. And the other creative thing that I saw, and I think this is great, was the synchronization with the budget. That to me made a lot of sense. So if this is for staff and staff hope, I don't want to use the word making less work, but that's not a bad vision if this will work for staff. So I like what you put out for us.
Yes. Not trying to just give ourselves less work, but but in a way we want there to be less confusion about the process, and we want it to be clearer for everybody, whereas now it's really dense and kind of jumbled and hard to read. So this is because the Growth Management Act doesn't provide a whole lot of direction around this. Every city does it a little differently. So we're hoping that what we present to you next month, and we're hoping what we present to you will be clear, and it'll feel like it's a process that both allows the applicants to feel heard and to feel like their ideas are fully vetted, but also gives staff a little more direction into how to proceed with those amendments and provides us the flexibility to, give resources to the review if we need it.
Transparency is always a good idea. My question is, how will the docket, I guess I'm not sure if it was docket 2016 or docket 2017, the docket that we forwarded to City Council near the end of last year, how will that be affected by this process?
That's a great question, and the short answer is that it will not be affected by this process.
Okay.
This is looking forward. We're making changes.
So we'll essentially go through that docket process one last time.
Correct.
And then from then on, we'll use the new process.
And to clarify, it's the docket that was set at the end of last year with several members of the commission, not everybody, but set at the end of 16, which was then forwarded to City Council, and a couple of the text amendments were put on the docket.
That's right. Okay.
For some odd reason, I feel compelled to draw upon the spirit of late Commissioner Frank Blau and recognizing this whole repeal and replace language in here. It's, I don't know. Just kind of, anyway, so I share Larry's sentiment about this synchronizing the docket and the budget. It seemed like that was actually one of the reasons that some of those docket items were turned down, because we just didn't have things synced up. So I think that'll make the community happy for sure. And I like the fact that you're referencing the RCW more and let someone else kind of manage the code updates, and that way it kind of frees you guys up from having to do that. So I'd encourage you to search for those opportunities wherever possible.
Any other comments, feedback? So I guess what we'll do is when we see the code, when it gets posted as the agenda, everyone take a really good look. And if it feels like we need to have more discussion, we can. And if it feels like the proposal is something we can live with and something we like, then we can move ahead with the public hearing. Maybe we'll just play it by ear.
It might be great for you to send out those. You said there was a couple neighboring city things that you do have. I mean, we could probably all love some light reading, right? So you could maybe send that over and we can.
Yeah, that's a good idea. At least familiarize ourselves with what you've been looking at. Okay, I think that wraps that item up. And so with that, I think we need to move on to public comment. So this is, oh yes. Oh, well, let me just introduce it real quick. Oh, that's okay. It's time for public comment. In this portion, oh, just wait 1 second. In this portion of the public comment, members of the public have 7 minutes to speak on an agenda-related item. So please come on up and state your name and address.
Made for somebody bigger than me. My name's Jolie Imperatori. I live at 745 2nd Avenue Northwest in Issaquah, but I have been a resident since 1971 till I just moved on the Sammamish Plateau. I also was on the original comp plan committee, and I've been on all of the comp plan committees from 1974 on for the Sammamish Plateau, or it was different names, different times. Anyway, I don't really have a problem except biannually. Last year, when you came for the docket, 4 of those things were small rezones done by private individuals. And the city council sort of flubbed it up so nobody got through, including the city's own projects that they wanted on the docket. But if you do it biannually, if you have to wait 2 years to get on the docket, and then let's say you want to do a small rezone of your property, that takes about a year to get done with the city, you know, just the matter of getting the work done that is required for a rezone by the city staff, and then going through the public hearing process. So that's 3 years. It takes too long to get anything done through the government now. And to put it out where you'd have to wait 2 years if you miss the cutoff is just not reasonable and not fair to your citizens who may need this property or are sitting on it, or it's a retirement. There's a lot of things why people have held property for a while, one of which is the market. The market dictates whether some of this stuff is saleable and in what zoning is it most saleable. So to expect a private citizen, let's say that has 5 acres and wants to zone it into from R1 to R4, would make it approximately 3 years from the time they come to the city council in December to get on the docket. You would, if you pushed it through as the planning commission, which our project you did last time. And then you'd have to, let's say you missed it and you didn't get in by September 30th or whatever the date's going to be this week. You would then have to wait for approximately 3 years before you could, if you got on the docket, if you could rezone it and then perhaps sell it or use the property in the highest misuse. And I think 2 years, as I say, it takes forever to get a building permit, much less a rezone, and then have to wait for 2 years to even apply to do a rezone. It's just not fair to your constituents, because you have a lot of control over some of the people's lives who have lived up here a long time, and then, you know, their property, they want to sell it now and retire or whatever. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. The market's good, which it is now. I mean, I've been in the real estate business, and from 2007 to 12, you couldn't give away a piece of property. So you have a really big obligation to the constituents of the city, not to the RCW. You can follow all those things, but the longer you put the timing out, the more unfair you're going to be. Because if you don't get in by September 30th, you got to wait 2 years before you can even get on the docket. And then if you say okay, then we can apply for a rezone, which is a lengthy process and a lot of public hearings and things that go on. So I think that for the people who live here, who have property that they've most of the time been here for years, longer than probably most of you, and then they can't use their property because the process is so lengthy and cumbersome. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak tonight? Mr. Stickney?
Good evening. Oopsie. Planning Commission, Paul Stickney at 504 28th Ave Southeast. Relatively short comments this evening. On the first half of the evening on the setbacks and the, I'll spit out my B, buffers from the street. I like what the commission has, adopted, and I believe that all the sort of counterpoints and alternatives by Commissioner Garrison are well reasoned and on tact, and it'll be real good for the city council to see all those things. I think it was a real good meeting this evening. Only one thing to add on that. A couple meetings ago, when you have an R1 that is going to but R6 or higher, I suggest you ask the city council to consider, should all of the amount of that buffer, I'll spit out my darn B, be on one of the properties, or should it be split like a half street? So like if a subdivision comes in and there's a half street made and then someone else subdivides next door and there's a half street, should all of the impact be on who comes first, or should it be split? Okay, on chapter 24, Doug or Dave, is there a chance to look at that slide with the A through F criteria again? Because one thing I think that was missing from that is in the comp plan is one more purpose or test or condition, is a statement of how the amendment or the change complies with regional or county goals and policies, which is in our comp plan. And that's a real important part, because the GMA, Department of Commerce, RCW's, WACs, et cetera, up here. Then PSRC has got regional regional planning policies, and then King County does too. And that's in our comp plan. So it's just important to make sure that that gets in chapter 24 or title 24. In regards to the 2-year and the 1-year, I think that idea has merit, but I'd like to suggest that some real study be done into maybe having 2 categories. Let me give a couple examples. A simple text change, or what happens if the city wants to annex something like Klahani. In 2014, the city added Klahani and got it done in a year. If it had to live with a 2-year cycle, that may not be in the city's interest. We have to update our comprehensive plan, and we is the king's we here. We have to update our comp plan with, I think transportation and infrastructure is going through comp plan updates this year. Would they be subject to a 2-year cycle? As the previous speaker talked, maybe there are certain criteria that would fall or silo into a 1-year cycle and a 2-year cycle, and some thought should be given to both. So that's the end of my comments.
Okay, it doesn't look like there's anyone else left to speak. So that is going to be the end of our public comment this evening. And before we move to adjourn, I wanted to remind everyone that the May 4th meeting has been canceled. So we won't meet again until the, the 3rd or 4th meeting in May, which is May 18th. I just want to remind everybody. And with that,
the following up with the chair was correct. Well, that's the wrong button. However, there is some investigation to see if there will be a joint meeting on with the city council on May 9th. Is that
correct? Thank you, Commissioner Crandall. At the beginning of the meeting, it was pointed out that the website incorrectly calls the May 9th. So there's some question that we will get clarity on that. We will look into it. We'll fix the any errors if there are any.
The May 9th meeting is it's a city council meeting, and the Parks Commission and the Planning Commissions are invited to join the city council at 5 o'clock for dinner and to discuss, I believe, the same couple of subjects that the Commission and the Parks Commission discussed just a few weeks ago. Land acquisition strategy, urban forestry. I was actually on vacation that week. Were those the 2 items you discussed, I believe?
and
Maybe the pro plan?
Pro plan, yeah.
Yeah, so So essentially, the discussion from a couple weeks ago that you had with the Parks Commission, City Council would like to convene both groups to join the council and to further those discussions a little bit at 5 o'clock on Thursday, May 9th.
Okay, thank you.
And on that note, did we happen to get a volunteer to serve on the interview committee for the urban forest consultant?
Oh, that's right. Do we have details about when that would happen?
No solid dates, just
No
yet.
solid dates. Okay.
Would it be, should I get those dates before anybody volunteers? That's probably a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, and it might,
Could you describe could you please describe what the person will be doing?
Just sitting in on our interviews with potential consultants for the urban forest management plan. So it'll probably be, I imagine, just one day, possibly 2 days. Shouldn't be that long.
just like a 2-3 hours an interview, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm an old landscape architect. I'd be willing to do it.
Is there anyone else who'd like to volunteer?
I'd also consider, I've attended quite a few of the seminars and study sessions on urban forest management.
I see no reason there can't be 2, so.
Okay.
I'll be in touch with you all about, the dates won't be set for another month or 2, but I'll mark you down.
Okay. Good. Thank you guys for volunteering. All right. So I need a motion to adjourn.
I second that motion.
All those in favor of adjourning the meeting this evening?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? No. So the meeting will be adjourned this evening at 8:06.